The Cascade Heights Homeowners Association, HOA, had always been known for its strict regulations, but nothing had prepared the protagonist for the battle ahead. Victoria Reed, the HOA president, sent an official letter demanding that they drain the century-old natural spring on their property, citing it as a flood risk. The protagonist, having lived on this land for years, knew better. The spring had been there long before the neighborhood was developed, its waters flowing steadily without causing any harm. But Victoria, with her steely demeanor and unrelenting push for control, wasn't interested in history or nature. She was interested in power. The protagonist immediately suspected there was more to this demand than simple flood prevention. After all, the spring had never caused an issue before. Why now? As they read through the HOA's documents, something felt off. The geological report used to justify the order was vague, lacking the kind of concrete evidence one would expect from a legitimate environmental assessment. And then there was Victoria's rush to enforce the mandate, pressuring the protagonist to comply without room for debate. Something wasn't right, the protagonist. This wasn't just about an arbitrary HOA ruling, it was personal. The spring was a family treasure, a living piece of their grandfather's legacy. Decades ago, before developers ever laid the first foundations in Cascade Heights, their grandfather had nurtured the land, carefully planting weeping willows along the spring's edge and carving out small pathways for quiet walks through nature. Every summer, as a child, the protagonist had sat by the water's edge, listening to the stories of their grandfather's youth, tales of how the spring had been a source of life, sustaining wildlife and providing a place for people to gather in times before suburban sprawl took over. The very thought of destroying something so deeply tied to their family history was unthinkable. It wasn't just a pool of water, it was a symbol of continuity, of resilience, of a time when people worked with the land rather than against it. As they ran their fingers through the cool, clear water, memories of childhood flooded back. The laughter of siblings skipping stones, the rustling of leaves in the summer breeze, the steady croak of frogs hidden among the reeds, these were things no amount of HOA pressure could erase. But Victoria Reed didn't care about any of that. To her, the land was just another bargaining chip in a larger game. The more the protagonist investigated, the clearer it became that Victoria's motivations had nothing to do with protecting the neighborhood from floods. In hushed conversations with longtime residents, they uncovered whispers of shady real estate deals and suspiciously timed property sales. The theory was simple. Victoria and her developer friends were trying to drive down property values so they could buy land for pennies on the dollar, only to later build expensive high-rises and make a fortune. By forcing the removal of the spring, Victoria could claim it was a hazard, triggering lower appraisals and creating a buying frenzy among her allies. The protagonist began connecting the dots, realizing that the so-called flood risk was nothing more than a fabricated crisis designed to serve corporate greed. More damning still, the geological report used to justify the drainage order had been conducted by none other than Victoria's brother-in-law, a man whose professional license had been revoked years ago for fraudulent practices. It was an intricate web of corruption, with Victoria at the center, pulling the strings. The protagonist couldn't stand by and watch their home, their history, and their community be destroyed for the sake of someone else's profit. But challenging an HOA president as powerful as Victoria would be no small feat. Determined to uncover the truth, the protagonist sought out a second opinion on the geological report. They contacted an independent hydrologist, Dr. Elaine Carter, who agreed to examine the land and provide her own assessment. Within days, she confirmed what the protagonist had suspected all along. The HOA's report was a complete fabrication. The spring posed no genuine flood threat. In fact, it actually helped regulate the water table, preventing oversaturation and reducing the likelihood of basement flooding. Furthermore, the fraudulent report had exaggerated water levels and even altered historical data to fit the HOA's narrative. Armed with this new evidence, the protagonist confronted Victoria at the next board meeting, presenting Dr. Carter's findings and demanding an explanation. But Victoria, ever the manipulator, brushed off the accusations with a smug smile. "We stand by our decision," she said coolly, dismissing the report as inconclusive and refusing to acknowledge the glaring inconsistencies. It was clear that Victoria wasn't just bending the rules, she was outright breaking them. But without undeniable proof of her corruption, it would be difficult to hold her accountable. Determined to take things further, the protagonist began investigating Victoria's financial records, looking for any signs of mismanagement. Their persistence paid off when they stumbled upon a shocking discovery. Victoria had been using HOA funds to funnel money into her brother-in-law's drainage company, essentially paying him for fraudulent reports and unnecessary services. But that wasn't all. In a quiet conversation with Martha, one of the more timid board members, the protagonist uncovered an even darker truth. Victoria had been bribing HOA board members with personal favors, offering things like fast-tracked home additions, reduced HOA fees, and even promises of leadership positions in exchange for their loyalty. Some, like Martha, had accepted out of fear, others out of greed. With this revelation, the protagonist knew they had what they needed to expose Victoria. But time was running out. That very night, under the cover of darkness, Victoria sent a team of workers to the protagonist's property to drain the spring. By morning, the once vibrant waters had vanished, leaving only cracked earth and the broken remains of century-old willows. The protagonist stood in stunned silence, heart pounding with anger and grief. Victoria had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The protagonist had known Victoria Reed was ruthless, but nothing could have prepared them for the brazen act of destruction that unfolded in the dead of night. Ignoring formal procedures, environmental guidelines, and a pending legal challenge, Victoria mobilized a team of contractors under the cover of darkness. Massive pump trucks rolled onto the property, hoses hissing as they siphoned the spring dry. The workers, clearly uncomfortable, mumbled apologies but insisted they were just following orders. The protagonist stood helpless, clutching the court injunction that hadn't been delivered in time. By morning, the once lush sanctuary was reduced to a mud pit. The willows, those graceful sweeping trees planted by their grandfather, drooped lifelessly, their roots exposed to the sun. Frogs, fish, and birds that had called the spring home were gone. Victoria didn't even bother to deny what she'd done. "We were protecting the neighborhood," she said coldly at a board meeting, eyes daring anyone to object. What she had really done, however, was unleash the beginning of a disaster far more devastating than any flood. The spring had acted as a natural pressure valve for the underground aquifer, slowly releasing excess water and maintaining a delicate hydrological balance. With it gone, the land began to unravel. Within 2 weeks, the first signs appeared: soggy lawns that refused to dry, basements seeping water from beneath their foundations, and a surge of mold infestations spreading through walls like silent rot. Then came the sinkholes, small at first, but growing in number and severity. Retaining walls buckled, driveways cracked, and trees listed sideways as the ground gave way beneath them. The spring hadn't been a threat, it had been a guardian. Without it, the aquifer overflowed chaotically, unable to release pressure in its usual slow, controlled way. The irony was cruel. Residents who had championed Victoria's actions now faced thousands in repairs, and those who had been skeptical suffered just as deeply. Nature, stripped of its balance, fought back indiscriminately. And still, the HOA insisted it had made the right as insurance companies began denying claims under the clause of man-made alterations to land. The tide of public opinion shifted dramatically. Homeowners who had once defended Victoria now stood outside HOA meetings holding protest signs. Social media groups erupted with furious posts, pictures of ruined basements, screenshots of insurance rejections, and even a video of a toddler's birthday party cut short by a collapsing backyard patio. The protagonist, who had once been an outlier, was now hailed as a truth-teller. More residents came forward, describing how they'd been pressured or misled into supporting the spring's destruction. Some even admitted they had never believed the flood narrative but feared retaliation from Victoria and her board. A sense of betrayal hung over the neighborhood like a fog. People wanted answers, accountability, and above all, justice. The once pristine community of Cascade Heights was now a war zone of lawsuits, neighborly feuds, and crumbling infrastructure. Victoria, increasingly cornered, began to show cracks in her polished facade. Recognizing the power of public exposure, the protagonist compiled a timeline of events, complete with photos, expert testimony, and financial records, and shared it online. Within days, the story went viral on local forums and news outlets. Reporters flocked to Cascade Heights, interviewing residents standing ankle-deep in flooded basements and filming footage of the ruined spring site. A particularly powerful segment aired during the evening news, the protagonist standing beside the dry spring bed, holding a photo of their grandfather planting the first willow. The emotional contrast between past and present struck a chord with viewers. Public outrage grew. News anchors questioned the legality of HOA overreach. Environmental advocates chimed in, calling the destruction of the spring an ecological crime. Petitions began circulating, demanding a full investigation. With mounting pressure, the local council could no longer ignore the controversy. They launched a formal inquiry, And suddenly, Victoria Reed was no longer a figure of authority. She was the face of a scandal unraveling by the hour. The breaking point came when Martha, one of the board members who had previously backed Victoria, stepped forward publicly. In a trembling but resolute voice, she admitted to accepting bribes, promises of a new sunroom on her home, special exemptions from community guidelines, and even whispered threats if she voted against Victoria's plans. She wasn't alone. Over the following days, 2 more board members revealed similar stories, each confession adding another brick to the case against Victoria. One revealed audio recordings of Victoria offering perks in exchange for loyalty. Another provided emails in which she openly discussed manipulating neighborhood votes. The illusion of legitimacy that had shielded her for so long was shattered. Under oath during a city hearing, Martha detailed how votes were rigged, objections silenced, and anyone who resisted was smeared or fined into submission. It was no longer just about a spring, it was a systemic abuse of power. As media cameras rolled and community members watched in stunned silence, it became clear that Victoria's empire was built not on leadership, but on lies, intimidation, and exploitation. The investigation, now led by both city auditors and state-level legal authorities, quickly uncovered a tangled web of financial misconduct that traced back years. Victoria Reed had treated the HOA's budget like her personal slush fund. Bank records revealed she had rerouted tens of thousands of dollars to a shell company, Clear Drain Solutions LLC, which, upon closer examination, turned out to be owned by her brother-in-law, the same man behind the falsified geological report. Payments for supposed land maintenance were wildly inflated or duplicated. Receipts were doctored. In one case, a payment was made for the drainage of another hazardous water feature that didn't exist. HOA funds meant for community improvements, sidewalk repairs, security lights, landscaping, had vanished into a black hole of fraud. Meanwhile, residents had been fined for trivial violations like incorrect mailbox colors or leaving trash cans out too long. The hypocrisy enraged the neighborhood. Once Victoria's embezzlement became public knowledge, residents realized they had been paying not for community upkeep, but to line the pockets of a corrupt dictatee. As the weight of evidence mounted, Victoria became increasingly desperate. Her deflections and denials grew more erratic during board meetings. She accused her accusers of being part of a smear campaign, claimed the news media had been bought, and at one point suggested that the spring had been cursed. But the final blow came in the form of irrefutable video evidence. One brave resident, a tech-savvy teenager named Zoe, had installed a security camera facing the common greenbelt behind her home. The footage it captured showed Victoria accepting an envelope from one of her developer contacts, an envelope stuffed with cash, and promising expedited rezoning approval in return. That same week, during yet another heated board meeting, Victoria's own home flooded dramatically. Brown water surged through her basement windows and poured out into her pristine garden while news crews captured the moment live. The symbolism was unmistakable. The very force she had tried to control and exploit had come back to consume her. Within 48 hours, Victoria Reed was arrested on charges of embezzlement, environmental destruction, conspiracy to commit fraud, and bribery. The court proceedings were swift and damning. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: financial records, whistleblower testimonies, expert analyses, and the now infamous video footage. Residents testified about the financial and emotional toll of Victoria's actions: lost insurance claims, destroyed property, and irreparable trust in the neighborhood's governance. Even her own legal team couldn't argue for her innocence, pivoting instead to a plea for leniency based on emotional strain and misguided leadership. The judge was unmoved. "You used your position not to serve the community," he said, "but to exploit it. You corrupted every level of oversight and endangered lives for personal gain." Victoria was sentenced to 15 years in state prison without the possibility of early parole. Her assets, including her home, vehicles, and remaining bank accounts, were seized and liquidated to help repay the HOA and affected homeowners. It was the most high-profile scandal in the state's HOA history, and it sent shockwaves through homeowner associations everywhere. Victoria's name became synonymous with unchecked power and the cost of ignoring community voices. With Victoria gone, the neighborhood faced the daunting task of healing, not just physically, but emotionally. The spring had been reduced to a barren trench, but it wasn't beyond saving. The protagonist, now a local hero, led a community-wide effort to restore the site. With the help of environmental groups and indigenous water specialists, they began carefully rebuilding the spring using traditional water management techniques passed down through generations of Native American stewardship. Volunteers hauled stones, replanted native flora, and reshaped the springbed to encourage natural flow. Children painted signs warning against further development. Old and young alike came together in weekend work crews, transforming grief into action. What had once been a symbol of loss now became a rallying point for hope. The community adopted a new charter emphasizing ecological protection, transparency, and collective decision-making. It was the dawn of a new era for Cascade Heights, one defined not by rules and fines, but by collaboration, sustainability, and shared ownership of their land and future. Martha, who had once been complicit but later instrumental in exposing Victoria, was elected as the new HOA president in a landslide vote. Humbled by her previous role in the scandal, she promised a new era of transparency and democracy. Her first acts included eliminating punitive fines, establishing an open-door policy for board meetings, and forming a community environmental committee led by residents and scientists alike. Under her leadership, the HOA rewrote its bylaws to prevent unchecked authority, requiring financial transparency and a rotating board system to distribute power more evenly. Where Victoria ruled with fear, Martha led with humility. Her voice trembled during speeches, but her conviction was strong. The community, once splintered by division and mistrust, began to heal under her guidance. Residents who had once feuded over lawn codes and HOA fees were now planting wildflowers together and discussing conservation plans over coffee. The very institution that had nearly destroyed the neighborhood was now becoming its foundation for resilience and renewal.